A Russian court has handed down a judgment against Google. But only Putin would be delusional enough to claim more money than the world can supply. The penalty demanded is currently about $20 decillion, or to put that in simpler terms, about 20 billion trillion. Yeah, you heard that right. For those who have never heard of such a large sum of money, a decillion dollars is a number followed by 33 zeros. The ridiculous sum is currently the largest penalty to ever be given in legal history. And it seems a little senseless considering the limited Google assets in Russia right now. For starters, Google does not even have the financial capacity to pay this penalty, considering the fact that its market value is around $2 trillion, which is practically nothing next to what it's expected to cough up. For another perspective on this foolishness, this fine is 75.96 trillion times Elon Musk's net worth, infinitely more than Russia's own GDP, which was $8 trillion in 2023. So why is Russia coming for Google? And is this judgment even enforceable? As sanctions are starting to get the better of Moscow, it seems Putin's desperation to raise funds has skyrocketed. There's a lot of politics behind sharing content like this. We are constantly fighting Putin's bots under our videos. These tactics push our content back and make it harder for us to reach our expected goal. To help us, please like our videos and share them too. We really appreciate it. What we need to remember throughout this video is that this is all retaliation. As Russia continues to be pushed into a corner by the Western response to its invasion of Ukraine, it needs to get creative on how it's going to raise money to fund its war machine. The court case against Google started all the way back in 2020 when YouTube blocked Tsargrad TV from its site after the US imposed sanctions. YouTube also banned about 17 other channels, including Zvezda, Channel 1, Parliamentary Television, Moscow Media, and TV Center. Tsargrad TV is well known for its strong pro-Kremlin stance, and as tensions began to rise between Russia and the West, Russian channels began to face restrictions. After this case went to court, it was decided that Google needed to pay a penalty of $1,200, about 100,000 rubles, per day for the restrictions it had placed. And this amount would double every 24 hours if Google did not remove the restrictions. Google chose to ignore this court order, and the cumulative effect of the fine has reached today's ridiculous figure. Russia has dedicated a lot of time and energy to litigating media companies because it understands how they affect its propaganda machine. Another court case was brought in 2021 over an illegal content breach when a Moscow court fined Google $98 million, about 7.2 billion rubles, for repeated failure to delete content deemed illegal in Russia. The supposed illegal content was really anything that was not pro-Putin or the government. That would include this channel and this video you are watching right now. In this year, Russian authorities were working hard to silence tech companies, claiming that they were not moderating their content and it was interfering with the country's internal affairs. Hours after the Google verdict was announced, a $20.5 million, about 2 billion ruble, fine was handed to Meta, the parent company of Facebook. And Twitter was also handed a $30,848 fine, a 3 million ruble fine, for similar charges. The major target in all of these fines and restrictions was Putin's star opponent, Alex Navalny. The country's media regulator had blocked dozens of websites linked to his campaign groups, labeling them extremist, and it wanted all these other social media sites to follow suit. Google and Apple were also forced to remove an app dedicated to Navalny's smart voting campaign, which gave users advice on tactical voting to unseat Kremlin-aligned politicians. Other sites like LinkedIn and Dailymotion were also blocked for refusing to cooperate with authorities, and 6 major providers of virtual private networks were banned too. In response, Google told AFP news agency that it would study the court ruling before deciding on further steps. Putin's regime has been obsessed with developing a sovereign internet, which gives the government more control over what its citizens can access. When 2022 came around and Russia invaded Ukraine, Google escalated the tension by shutting down its Russian division. The company also closed its Google AdSense in Russia over the summer, meaning local content creators would no longer be able to receive monetization. Although Google and its YouTube services have remained accessible to Russians, the legal battles have only gotten wilder. In August of this year, The Telegraph reported that Moscow seized more than $100 million from Google's bankruptcy entity to help fund the war in Ukraine. According to the court documents, Google said Russia handed some of its assets to sanctioned TV channels like Tsargrad, who took the money and put it directly into the war effort. Google has also made it clear that the initial money due under the judgment was $12.5 million, meaning Russia seized more than it should have. After seeing that Google was not taking it seriously, Russia decided to reinforce its bogus judgment from 2020. The current figure that we're talking about now is an accrual from the judgment passed when Russia's courts first ordered Google to restore the YouTube channels it had closed. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov commented on the charge, stating that he can't even pronounce this figure right, but said the figure is filled with symbolism. The message that the Kremlin is trying to send with this penalty is that Google should not be restricting the actions of our broadcasters on its platform or participating in sanctions against the state. Google's response to this has been the same as its response to most of these cases: indifference. When CNN tried to get a comment from them, they stated that they were still looking into the legal matters. In a statement, Google said, "Civil judgments that include compounding penalties have been imposed upon us in connection with disputes regarding the termination of accounts, including those of sanctioned parties. We do not believe these ongoing legal matters will have a material adverse effect on earnings." In other words, Google is refusing to acknowledge Russia's wild goose chase for money. Months after the 2022 invasion, Google's Russia subsidiary filed for bankruptcy and paused most of its commercial operations after the government seized control of its bank accounts. According to a company representative, the company's debts exceeded $195 million, or 19 billion rubles, while its assets were $36 million, about 3.5 billion rubles. These continued litigations are pointless, considering the fact that in November of 2023, the court officially declared Google bankrupt. Now that Google has closed its operations in Russia, these courts do not have the jurisdiction to enforce this judgment. This is because they do not have the capacity to seize assets from outside of Russia's borders. Losing Google has been about so much more than getting a couple of channels closed down. To the Kremlin, Google is just another blow to its economic stability that it claimed would not crumble under sanctions. The loss of business from a company as big as Google had a devastating impact on Russia, but it was not the only company to walk out of the country in 2022. Now, recently we have crossed 1 million subscribers. Ever since then, we've been flooded with emails asking us questions and advice about growing a YouTube channel. Even though we try our best to reply to every single email, sometimes these take up too much time or they ask the same questions that have been answered before. That's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one email bootcamp for completely free. So, if you are someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can get our email bootcamp by clicking on the link in the description or by scanning the QR code on the screen. Okay, let's get back to the video. Multinational companies from every single industry pulled out of Russia as soon as Putin made the bad decision to invade Ukraine. After receiving a lot of backlash for not halting its business in Russia immediately, McDonald's, one of the biggest fast food chains in the world, said goodbye to its Russian market.
It's sad, of course, because I'm already used to eating my favorite ice cream, which I came here for today. But basically, when something new is coming, it's only natural, so we'll wait and see. Maybe it'll be even better.
McDonald's initially arrived in Russia in 1990 and quickly became a fast food staple for the Russian people. The opening of McDonald's first restaurant in Moscow was symbolic, as it showed that the Cold War tensions were thawing. Almost a year after this, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Russia began to open up its economy to companies from the West. More than 3 decades later, however, it was one of the first corporations to pull out. After 2022, the company began to cite the unpredictable business environment and the humanitarian crisis as its reasons for choosing to close down business. In March of 2022, it started by temporarily closing down 850 outlets. But after that, things became permanent when it started to sell its restaurants. This process is known as de-arcing, and it basically involves McDonald's retaking its name, branding, and menu and selling its sites to local buyers. The effect of this decision has had dire consequences on the employment market in Russia because about 62,000 employees were employed in these chains. The danger was that if the local buyers who purchased the chain did not wish to keep them on, they would be left stranded. To cover its exit, McDonald's wrote up a charge of $1.4 billion, and in a message to staff and suppliers, McDonald's chief executive Chris Kempczinski said, "This is a complicated issue that's without precedent and with profound consequences. Some might argue that providing access to food and continuing to employ tens of thousands of ordinary citizens is surely the right thing to do. But it is impossible to ignore the humanitarian crisis caused by the war in Ukraine. And it is impossible to imagine the golden arches representing the same hope and promise that led us to enter the Russian market." Many people were devastated by the closing. But let us take, for instance, this man. He was recorded making a last-ditch attempt to prevent the McDonald's outlet from closing down when he chained himself to the door of the store and exclaimed, "Closing down is an act of hostility against me and my fellow citizens." After a lot of fighting, he was dragged away by the police, who ended his protest. Less enthusiastic people elsewhere simply scrambled to the branches and savored the burgers for the last time. Some customers reportedly hoarded the meals, and then when the franchise closed down, they sold them online for prices equivalent to the average monthly salary of Russians. Culturally and economically, the exit of McDonald's was a large shift that the country has still not recovered from to this day. Shortly after McDonald's, the coffee giant Starbucks followed suit. In May of 2022, Starbucks exited the Russian market, marking the end of its presence in Russia since 2007. The country had opened about 130 stores operated by its licensee, Al-Shaya Group. This approach is uniquely different from how other countries chose to run their businesses in Russia. Unlike franchises like McDonald's, Starbucks did not actively operate its cafes in Russia. What it did was sell its rights through a licensing deal to partners. These partners, in turn, hired about 2,000 employees across the country. At first, Starbucks eased into its exit by suspending services and stopping shipments of its products to the country. Then, when it saw other Western countries taking a bold stance, it followed suit. For 6 months after the departure of Starbucks, employees still took home their salaries as assistance for them to transition to other working opportunities. Starbucks also took a very bold stance by Ukraine, and in a statement to its partners, it wrote, "First, we will donate any royalties we receive from our business operations in Russia to humanitarian relief efforts for Ukraine. Second, the Starbucks Foundation has contributed $500,000 to World Central Kitchen and the Red Cross for humanitarian relief efforts for Ukraine. And third, our EMEA business will continue to work in the market to support people in need through additional financial contributions and services. As this dynamic situation continues to unfold, we will listen and take additional steps to support all our partners and communities. We will let you know as we have more to share." The choice to leave Russia was made for most of the major companies. Shareholders refused to stand behind the generation of profit in Russia, and the companies began to feel the hit when their share prices began to plummet drastically. Because of the global opinion on Russia's actions, investment stopped, and even other major food companies like Nestle, Mondelez, Procter & Gamble, and Unilever had to halt business to avoid losing share values. While we would like to pretend that it was all about social responsibility, the decision for a lot of companies to leave Russia was political, especially with Zelensky appealing to multinationals to stop doing business with the devil. Let's take Renault, for example. In an address to the French parliament, Ukrainian President Zelensky made a point to single out 3 companies: Renault, Auchan, and Leroy Merlin, who he accused of sponsoring the Russian war machine. He even went as far as to say that the French car maker was financing the murder of children and women and rape by choosing to forget its values and worry more about profits. Earlier on in the week before Zelensky's address, Ukraine's foreign minister had called for a global boycott of Renault products, given its decision to stay in the Russian market. The decision was a little more difficult for Renault to make, considering what was at stake. Companies like Volkswagen, Nissan, and Mercedes-Benz simply had to stop exporting to Russia, which was not as big of a hit for their markets. Things were different for Renault because Russia made up a tenth of its global revenue, while France owned a 15% stake in Renault. Renault was also in control of 68% of Autovaz, the largest car maker in Russia, which is the Renault Group's second largest market, with 500,000 vehicles sold in 2021. What Renault did was sell its shares in Autovaz with a 6-year option to buy back its stake. According to the Renault CEO, this was the most responsible decision because it would keep its 45,000 employees in business and give it an opportunity to return when the circumstances were better. For now, the Soviet-era Moskvich brand is going to take over, and it has already begun production of passenger cars. You would think that Russia taking over the manufacturing of cars would actually be a plus for the country, but the statistics show something different. According to the Association of European Businesses, the sales of new cars in Russia have dropped by 63% because Russian car maker Autovaz has been placed on the US's Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons list, the SDN list. This means that the cars that Russia is currently manufacturing can only be used in the country, as the sanctions on the business have been detrimental to the export of Russian vehicles to the global market. In an attempt to save the business, 2.5 decided to relaunch production by partnering with Chinese companies to manufacture vehicles. Unfortunately, these partnerships are slowly breaking down because of these secondary sanctions that will be imported on Chinese companies that trade with sanctioned businesses. This means that Russian car-making businesses like 2.5 are going to be out of business soon. Instead of benefiting the manufacturing industry, this season has benefited the second-hand car market, which is booming with budget Ladas and Chinese cars selling better than premium brands. What is even sadder is that Russia cannot even turn to its closest ally, China, during this automotive crisis. The payment issues between Russia and China, caused by US sanctions, mean that Russian importers of Chinese cars have been losing out on big business. This has not been bad news for China, which is always looking for an opportunity to profit with misfortune. Beijing has taken over Russia's car market and begun to sell since companies like Nissan and Renault pulled out. This may be beneficial for China, but with no car production happening in Russia, Moscow is getting the short end of the deal. The reason a lot of businesses are opting out of working in Russia is the never-ending impact of sanctions on the market. With sanctions limiting forms of payment and the war creating huge uncertainty over future prices and consumer appetite, the business climate is not conducive for a lot of companies. Fashion retailers like H&M and Zara are also among the brands that have decided to diplomatically suspend their sales as they watch on for developments in the war. While the West did a good job impacting Russia's economy from different sectors, the strike on the oil sector was definitely a hit to the jugular. Russia's oil business used to be the largest supplier and the top oil producer globally. Now, because the US and Europe are hitting Russia with unprecedented sanctions, the oil companies that used to run in these countries were forced to cut ties with Russia as well. Britain's BP and Shell, and Norway's Equinor, have all shut down their operations in Russia. The oil giant BP had to exit and leave behind its $14 billion stake in Russian oil company Rosneft. According to BP chair Helge Lund, Russia's attack on Ukraine is an act of aggression that it cannot overlook. BP has operated in Russia for over 30 years, but it could no longer continue to work together with Rosneft, considering its political and military ties to the war. This is because Rosneft is chaired by Igor Sechin, the former deputy prime minister of Russia and a Putin ally. Back in 2014, the United States sanctioned Rosneft after Russia's annexation of Crimea, and since then, BP's involvement with the country has been controversial. The firm has pledged to no longer buy oil, but it states that the contracts it signed before the invasion of Ukraine will have to be fulfilled. It took some bullying, but Shell also got onto the bandwagon eventually. Shell was heavily criticized in March of 2022 when news came out that it bought Russian crude oil at a very low price after the war started. In anticipation of how badly Russia would be hit by sanctions, Shell took the opportunity to make a quick buck. The Ukrainian foreign minister took to social media to ask the question, "Doesn't Russian oil smell of Ukrainian blood for you?" In response to people's critiques about the company's greed, Shell apologized and immediately stopped buying oil from Russia. The company quit its joint ventures with Gazprom and also ended its involvement in the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was supposed to be between Russia and Germany. As part of Shell's withdrawal plans, the company said it would offload a 27.5% stake in a Russian liquefied natural gas facility, a 50% stake in an oilfield project in Siberia, and an energy joint venture. It also shut down about 500 service stations and halted its aviation fuel and lubricant operations in the country. In a bid to do damage control, the company stated that Shell has not renewed longer-term contracts for Russian oil and will only do so under explicit government direction. But we are legally obliged to take delivery of crude bought under contracts that were signed before the invasion. For years, these Western energy companies have been able to turn a blind eye and compromise with the Russian government as a part of the cost of doing business there. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed everything for them, and they could no longer continue on under the radar. The corporate reputation of a lot of these companies is extremely important, considering the fact that they have interests in other countries and their shareholders hold their own opinions. Putin's invasion is too much of a high-profile incident for companies to ignore, and this has led to most of them moving out. The problem for these companies and Russia is the fact that a lot of Russian firms facing sanctions don't have the resources to acquire these foreign investors' assets. This leaves private equity firms as the only potential investors as they face less scrutiny than publicly traded companies. The Russian energy sector is struggling because it depends heavily upon Western companies' technologies, especially for hard-to-recover oil projects and offshore projects. The big three, BP, Shell, and ExxonMobil, will leave significant technological voids that are going to be impossible to fill. By the first quarter of 2024, Gazprom recorded its first annual loss in over 2 decades of nearly $7 billion. Due to being cut off in Europe, the plan was to move supply to Asia, but this did not work out due to the lack of infrastructure, as gas is mostly transported via pipeline. The cap on the sale of gas also means that Russia is selling way below the profit line. Pre-invasion, Russia was negotiating contracts of $350 to $380 per 1,000 cubic meters. But now it's fighting just to get $297 out of China. These low prices will mean more losses, and it does not help that China has other alternatives. Even if we wanted to, we would not be able to go through all the companies that left because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. According to the Yale School of Management, over 1,000 companies exited Russia since 2022. According to the Kyiv School of Economics Institute, as of September 2023, 300 international companies have permanently left Russia. Every sector has taken a hit, from aircraft services to the tech industry and production. Putin may try to pretend that there has been no impact at all, but this mass exodus has meant a lot of losses for the Russian economy, and it's unlikely that it will ever recover. The most impressive part of all of this is how effective the sanctions and global pressure have been in pushing Russia into a corner. Daniel Tannenbaum, the global head of sanctions at the consulting firm Oliver Wyndham, said, "Never before have we seen such a significant economy be subject to such comprehensive actions. And at the present pace, we're seeing Russia well on its way to being spoken of in the same breath as Cuba and Iran." One of the major impacts we need to discuss is the hit to employment. We discussed it briefly when we talked about the employees who were laid off by companies like McDonald's and Starbucks, but let's take consulting firms as a case study. Accenture, a global management and technology company, discontinued its business in Russia and stated that it stood with Ukraine. As of March 3rd, over 2,300 employees lost their jobs, and all they received was a thank you for their dedication and service over the years. Another professional service giant, Deloitte, stopped its services in both Russia and Belarus. It promised to assist its professionals as best it could, but 3,000 professionals were laid off as a result of their exit. Ernst & Young was not to be left behind, and it removed its Russian practices as well. The effect of this was that 4,700 professionals in 9 cities lost their jobs. Consulting and accounting firm KPMG International said that its Russia and Belarus firms will leave the KPMG network, and ended its working relationship with over 4,500 people. Although KPMG sympathized with its staff, it emphasized that the decision was not about them. Its focus was on the Russian government and making sure there were consequences for its actions. From the 4 companies that we discussed here, we are already looking at 14,500 personnel without jobs in just one sector. Foreign companies have become such an integral part of the Russian economy, and a lot of Russian people felt the effects of them leaving. All this litigation with Google and the mass exodus of other global household names is pointing to a bigger problem that we cannot escape, which is that Russia's economy is crumbling. After the exit of these companies, the ruble lost 1/3 of its value, and Russian inflation hit 15%, with the GDP falling by 5%. Putin's brash move to invade Ukraine failed to account for the fact that Russia is actually heavily dependent on foreign investment from Western countries. According to an analysis by The Economist of bilateral data on stocks of long-term investments, boy, that was a mouthful, the Russian economy is more reliant on the West than it was a decade ago. About 30% of Russian imports came from G7 countries, and in some industries like chipmaking and computers, Russia remains wholly dependent on American parts. Things have gotten so bad that the cards of some Russian banks under sanctions no longer work with Apple Pay or Google Pay, which caused chaos on the Moscow metro in 2022 when they initially shut down. About 40% of Russia's GDP is in international reserves, and its short-term asset holdings are at an all-time high. Now, Russia probably thought that it could circumvent its problem because about 35% of its foreign currency was in gold and yuan. But with the recent issues with Chinese banks, Russia is in some serious hot soup. Up till this point, Russia has been relying on the yuan, but with reports of the yuan liquidity deficit, things are definitely going south in Moscow. This deficit in the liquidity of the yuan has come because China has refused to be paid in rubles and will only receive the yuan as payment. This pushback against the ruble makes perfect sense because the value of the ruble is volatile on the global market, and China does not want to be left with money that it can't change. As the ruble continues to plunge, reports from September show that the ruble fell by almost 5% against the yuan. More data from the Moscow Stock Exchange, MOEX, predicts that the central bank's daily yuan sales will rise to $200 million. As the situation gets out of hand, the central bank has its hands tied, because it cannot lend in yuan when it cannot cover its foreign currency position. A big part of the problem is also because financial sanctions have restricted the central bank from accessing a large portion of its foreign currency reserves held in international accounts. These reserves would have been used to stabilize the national currency, manage inflation, and finance government spending. By freezing these assets, the sanctions had the potential to significantly weaken Russia's financial stability and its ability to fund war expenditures, leading to economic instability. Due to these foreign currency shortages, Russian businesses have been forced to depend on yuan swap deals provided by the Bank of Russia, but these deals come at a ridiculously high cost. Swap deals are financial agreements between parties that are meant to help manage risk. In these deals, one party, in this case Russian businesses, pay a premium to the other party which compensates them for the risk of the financial transaction. In the first month of 2024, swap deals were being done at about 2.4 billion yuan on average. And then in June, when the US increased its threats about secondary sanctions, there was a frightening jump to 10.3 billion yuan. August of 2024 reported the worst numbers, with the figure jumping to 20 billion. If this continues, Russia will not have enough currency to be able to make any of its payments. The situation is only going to get worse, as Russian businesses report that there have been growing delays in payments with Chinese trading partners, with billions of yuan being withheld for months on end. The squeeze of sanctions is getting to Russia's closet ally, and now Chinese state banks are closing transactions with Russia in mass numbers and withholding payments to them. Financial institutions in China that were previously making payments to and for Russia have been scrutinizing the transactions heavily. And now, payments that are flagged are being held back by Chinese state banks. This means that Russian businesses that make their money through oil and gas exports are suffering the most. The situation intensified in August, when Chinese state banks carried out a mass shutdown of Russian transactions worth billions of yuan. For a long time, Putin seemed to be convinced that he could keep the Russian economy afloat without the assistance of the outside world. His move into Ukraine was calculated from a point of pride, and with the belief that he would be able to swiftly conquer Ukraine and carry on with his expansion. When the sanctions started pouring in, Russia was left paralyzed and humbled instantly by how quickly everyone turned against them. As the war comes to an end, Russia is going to have to salvage its dying economy and its national image at the same time.